Hello, and welcome to this Easy Data U tutorial on using pivot tables for data analysis. My name is Nicholas Ortiz. I am a technical assistance provider with the DaSy Center, and in this video series, we are going to cover tips and tricks to help you become a pro at using pivot tables to tackle your data analysis. By watching this video tutorial series, you will accomplish several objectives. Number one, you're going to learn how, when, and why to use pivot tables for data analysis. Number two, you will gain confidence and fluency in creating basic to intermediate pivot tables, and fluency in terms of both using the pivot tables as well as the terminology involved. Number three, you will learn how to prepare data for use with pivot tables. Number four, you'll discover how to create more user-friendly, interactive pivot tables. And finally, number five, you're going to learn how to manipulate pivot tables to help answer critical questions so that you can improve your data quality and make informed programmatic decisions. Let's talk about why you should use pivot tables. If you started this video series, you're clearly at least somewhat interested in pivot tables. Now, I promise it's an investment that will pay off, and you can do it without any coding skills whatsoever. Pivot tables are easy to use for data analysis, interactive, and efficient. Supporting staff with the use of pivot tables can help develop data literacy skills and build a culture of data use. Experience with pivot tables can help you, your staff, even those who are not, quote, data analysts, explore and interact with the data, better formulate questions and requests for data, and even do their own analyses. Now, even if you cannot do your own analyses, pivot tables can help you articulate what you want from your analysis and how to ask for it from your analyst. There are lots of examples of how pivot tables can benefit you, your data team, and your partners. Here are several examples to give you a flavor of how flexible pivot tables are. First of all, staff or program consultants can look at data for the local programs they work with and maybe examine data for special initiatives, such as the State Systemic Improvement Plan. Also, de-identified pivot tables can be made available to external work groups collaborating on special initiatives, like target setting. You can query large amounts of data in many user-friendly ways. You can summarize aggregate numerical data by categories and subcategories. You can filter, sort, group, and conditionally format the most useful and interesting subset of data, enabling you to focus on just the information you want. You can create custom calculations and formulas. You can expand and collapse levels of data to focus on your results and drill down to details from the summary data for areas of interest to you. You can move rows to columns or columns to rows or swap other variables in and out on the fly to see different summaries of the source data. This is a concept known as pivoting. You can present concise, attractive, and annotated online or printed reports. And finally, you can create interactive dashboards that allow users to explore your data more easily. I have been using pivot tables for well over a decade, and I consider it to be one of the top 3 skills I have ever learned in my data analysis career. No exaggeration. Once you've successfully created your first pivot table, I guarantee you will never look at data the same way again, and you will be pivoting data left, right, and every which way. So we do have a few notes and caveats before getting started. First of all, this tutorial assumes you have basic knowledge about Microsoft Excel, including familiarity with data laid out in rows and columns and the Excel ribbon menu. Also, we recommend using a computer running Microsoft Excel 2010 or later to practice using the pivot table features outlined in this series. We're going to demo some pivot table features that were not available in the earlier versions of Excel. Also, we're not going to cover all advanced features of pivot tables, but rather we're going to cover the features that we consider to be the most useful for state analysts based on our technical assistance experience. And finally, it's important to note how this course is laid out, with separate bite-sized videos that cover each specific tip and trick. You don't necessarily need to watch them in order, but if you are a first-time pivot table user, we do encourage this in order to scaffold your learning. To get the most out of this course, we do recommend downloading the sample data file under the resources section of this course to practice using pivot table features demonstrated in the video tutorials. For the best experience, try practicing the skills learned in one video using this sample data set before moving on to the next video in the series. One fundamental aspect of using pivot tables is understanding how your source data should be laid out. Essentially, your data need to be in a raw format with rows and columns as you see in the example on the left here. On the right-hand side, however, you see an example of pre-aggregated data with other superfluous information like titles. If any of your data come to you like this, we suggest moving it to a separate sheet as a best practice. Pivot tables generally will not work with data in this format. Also note that the data on the left are in what's called a wide format. Now, a wide format refers to having data laid out in one row per unit of analysis, which in our line of work is usually children or programs. So that is one row per child or one row per program. There's another format often called the long format, which has data laid out in one value per row, often with multiple records for a single individual or entity. You can Google these terms if you're not familiar with them, but they're not critical for our purposes here. What's important to know is that you can use pivot tables with both the long and wide formats, but this course and the sample data file will use the wide format. Let's get comfortable with a few basic terms and points of context. First of all, what is a pivot table conceptually? Well, it's a tool in Microsoft Excel that summarizes and reorganizes selected columns and rows of data. It doesn't actually change the data, rather it just pivots or turns the data to view it from different perspectives. It's essentially a cross-tabulation of your data. And you'll see the word pivot table sometimes referred to as just one word, pivot table. That's the brand Microsoft has given this idea in Excel, although you will find very similar features in other data analysis tools. Also, you'll work with four main components in a pivot table. The columns area represents the fields that define data in each of the rows that you add to a pivot table. It's going to split out the rows into different columns, and these are going to represent unique values in your data set. Next are the rows. These are also going to be unique values that show up in the first column in your pivot table. Next, we have values. This helps you define the values that are displayed as summarized information. For example, you can summarize your data by things like a count, a sum, an average, a minimum or a maximum, and other methods. Lastly, we have filters, which apply a restriction to the entire table. That is, they let you examine a subset of your data. Now, filters are optional, but often useful, and you must add something to the values field for the pivot table to start displaying summary data. And the real power comes, though, when you start adding something to the columns or rows fields. You might be wondering which pivot table features we're going to cover. Well, here's our list. We're going to start with preparing and formatting your data for use in a pivot table to make sure it functions correctly. Then we'll start with creating just a basic pivot table. We'll learn things like how to manipulate pivot table fields, how to perform table calculations and summarizations. We'll move into relabeling and sorting your labels, showing detail behind the aggregate numbers, adding subgroups and repeating all item labels, grouping and ungrouping labels. Then we'll move into some other features that let you drill down further into your data, like filters, slicers, and timelines. We'll show you some exciting formatting and design enhancements. And then we'll show a few other tricks, including how to show rows, columns, or cells with no data, how to refresh your pivot table, how to spin off multiple pivot tables from a single pivot table. Lastly, we'll cover how to create some really dynamic interactive features of pivot tables, including things like pivot charts and basic elements of a dashboard. And as mentioned earlier, each mini tutorial covers one of these topics. Again, feel free to pick and choose if you're looking for something specific, or go in order if you're a novice. And I promise, by the end of these tutorials, you're going to become familiar with all of these terms and features. With that, we invite you to make your way over to the other mini tutorials. We hope you enjoyed this video series and that it serves you well in learning how to slice and dice your data to answer some important questions.